Man, it's definitely gotten a lot colder in the last couple of weeks. Might have to even bust out the space heater soon. All right, welcome back, guys. So today we are installing the rear-wheel drive oil pan onto my RB25 Neo. The Neo happens to be an all-wheel drive block, so the actual oil pan it came with has the front-wheel drive components on it. So you have the ability, if you have the resources or the know-how, to cut up the all-wheel drive oil pan and remove the axles off of it and just run that sump. The problem is I don't have that oil pan anymore. I ended up selling it. So if you do have it and you know somebody that can weld with aluminum, that might be a better option, which I would obviously recommend more than doing this. What I'm doing is taking the rear-wheel drive RB25 oil pan and I'm gonna basically make it fit and modify it onto the all-wheel drive block. So right off the bat, just looking at the block compared to the rear-wheel drive block, you'll notice on the actual casting of the block, it's a lot thicker as far as the mounting spots for the oil pan. This is obviously because on the all-wheel drive, you're gonna have a lot more torque being put onto the bottom of this block. And then right here, you will notice that the there are two thread patterns, the rear-wheel drive oil pan and larger bolts for the all-wheel drive. Well, there we go. She is upside down, and we definitely want to clean this up quite a bit here. So the first issue when you're fitting on the rear-wheel drive sump is that this oil pickup on the rear-wheel drive block will actually be right here. So if you look, the position of this guy should be closer to about in the middle of the block. So also, when you do fit that oil pan on, these are the bolts we're going to be using. And if you look how close that gets to the actual fitting, so we're going to have to do two things. One, grind this down ever so slightly. And two, we're going to have to hit the oil pan in. The problem with hitting the oil pan in too much is that when you're trying to get the bolts in on the oil pan, they get covered as far as the actual head of the nut is too big to actually fit in there. For this particular job, the best thing to use is a razor blade. And again, make sure none of this stuff gets into the actual motor here, because you will have problems later. So the entire mating surface on the block for the oil pan is completely clean. I went ahead and put some degreaser on a rag and made sure to do that as well, so everything looks great. Now, if you are replacing the rear main seal, this is the time to do it. If you look, I have just enough space to reach in here and remove it. The reason why is because once you seal this up, the last thing you want to do is when you have the motor off the stand, having to remove this again can create a break in your seal here, and having to reseal one portion is not going to be as strong as it all being completely one piece. So at this point, I'm going to remove my rear main seal housing and replace the gasket for that as well, and the seal. So the rear main is held on by 6 10mm bolts, and I just cracked them loose. These shouldn't be too hard. Once those bolts are off, you can go ahead and pry this away from the actual block, and then just do this as even as possible, so that way you don't break anything. Should just come out just like that. I always look and see how much the seal actually sits in there, so you don't push it too far. It looks like it's not all the way backed in. There's actually about 2 millimeters of space behind the bracket, and then also about, I'd say, 1 millimeter right below the bevels where I'm going to put that new seal. So I'm going to clean that up, but if you don't have a full parts kit like this, I recommend purchasing one because it does come in handy instead of buying each of these separate. So there's a new one, so I'm going to take that off and clean this up. Alright, and to remove this old seal, again, you got to be careful with these casted parts because they do look, you know, pretty strong, but enough force and you can crack these and you can break these. So it is aluminum, and obviously another thing is making sure you don't bend them. So I took 2 pieces of wood, I sandwiched them this way, and the place you want to start from is this section here, because it does have the bracket right here, so it is going to be the strongest of the bracket itself. And when it's inside there, you want to aim towards, so closest to the outer lip of the old seal. If you look, it kind of messed up here, and if you hit it towards the center, it just breaks through. So again, make sure you hit it towards that outer lip and it'll pop right out. So on your bracket itself, just make sure you clean it up real nice, removing all the old RTV, and also making sure that these grooves are clear, so that way fresh new sealant will seal and stick onto the new bracket. And when that's done, make sure you also clean up the mating surface. Now this is obviously going to be a little bit harder just because it is in a tight space. Luckily with my hoist, it gave me enough room to access this. Now that everything is all clean, we are ready to install your actual seal. So what I like to do is put this on a piece of wood, and then something like a 2x4 that is wide enough to encompass the whole seal. That way when you do hammer this, it should distribute the weight evenly. And also making sure that your seal is pretty even as it sits already. Alright guys, so with the new seal completely flush with the housing, on the back side it actually is as far as it can go. There's some notches here where it doesn't let the seal go any further. They must have clearanced it a little bit better, so that way once it's flush here, it's pretty much good to go on the back. So it does come with some grease. I wiped that off and went ahead, I'm gonna reapply some new grease to it, so that way when it goes on there and starts spinning, it'll have enough lubrication to not bind this up or heat this up. So I wiped this down as well, so you can see this is the smooth part where it actually touches the seal. Alright, once you have an even coating, don't wait too long, because after about a couple minutes she starts to harden. So I'm going to get this on the motor right now. Alright, so those are in. I looked it up, the rear main seal torque as well as the oil pan torque is about 6-7 pounds. So not a whole lot, just enough to get her nice and snug in there. Alright, I went ahead and got a ruler. So roughly about 4 inches from the center of that section to the new location here. So if I have 4 inches here, roughly, I should be able to measure the distance between the center of this to about 4 inches here. So that's what we're gonna try to go for. And I do have a hole saw. So if you don't have that, make a quick run to your hardware store and grab one of these. I'm hoping to be able to actually create a hole here to make this work. So, all right, let's try it out. All right, so I made my pilot hole. I was hoping we were gonna be in the middle of a baffle where it's not, where it wasn't on a baffle, but you gotta work with what you have. So I got it right here, about 4 inches away from the existing area for the sump. So let's hope this works. So unfortunately the hole saw did not work, and most likely the reason behind that was this was a wood hole saw, not one made for metal, and all it did was just create a lot of heat and burn the teeth on the hole saw itself. So if you're gonna do this, make sure you do have a metal hole saw. I just had this laying around in a set thinking that it was made for my application, which it wasn't. Yep, just a bunch of heat and burning oil. So I ended up using an angle grinder to finish off this job, and I had to actually cut more than I thought I was going to, just because of the way the oil pickup routed, just like how it does at the bottom. The actual tube that picks up, you have to cut in regards to having space for that as well. So I cut more than I wanted to, but in the end it worked. So moving on to the oil pickup, this is one of the important parts of this modification. If you look at the flange on the oil pickup itself, it does protrude quite a bit from the actual tube. So this is what gets in the way of the oil pan sealing. Now, I did mark this off prior to grinding, just so that way you don't take off too much, because the most important part of this is making sure it does create a good seal on the block. So here you'll see how much I took off of the flange itself, which is about half the distance between the edge and the actual oil pickup. And it looks like I did a little bit more, but it's because of my line from the Sharpie marker is still there. So as you can see, we got a little more clearance from the path of where the oil pan is actually going to sit on the block right here. So now on the actual oil pan itself, we're going to go ahead and in that same spot, and I'm going to have to deburr all this here, but in the same spot between these two bolts, we're going to have to hit that down. So my plan is to take a torch to it for, just a little bit, just to warm it up, and that way it's a little bit easier to hit this spot here with a hammer, and then it should give us enough clearance to make the actual oil pan. I think that's as much as I need to do. I'm going to test fit it once more, and then I'm going to flatten this part out so that way she seals perfectly without any bolts first, and then that way the bolts just supplement the actual seal. And just to get this to sit flush, I just hammered a little bit. And also these here. Moment of truth. I'm going to put this down a little bit, but she lines up now. And now that I know she fits, I just get a nice chunk of wood here, and if you look, I've been hammering it straight, so as long as this whole side is straight again, everything should seal up nice and not pretty. that's for sure. So before we go any further, these two bolts right here, make sure to enlarge these holes to accept at least a 12mm bolt, just because when I put this on, it did not line up perfectly and it was a pain to install. So making these a little bit larger will make your life a lot easier. Okay, so now that I got everything nice and mocked up and everything is straight again, and if you look here, see what I'm filming here, but if you see, she's pretty straight again. And then I also got the side. Good way to tell is if you put it flat on its face, everything should still be equal to the ground. And if you look, that is where I worked that edge. I didn't, on previous videos or on other videos I saw they had to bang this out so much that you couldn't even put the bolts on. And this actually doesn't look too bad. And now, at this point, I'm going to take a flopper disc and I'm going to clean up all these cuts that I made. That way you don't have any pieces of metal falling off. And then I'm also going to get a brass wire brush and remove all this before putting on the new gasket. Alright guys, so pan is just about ready. I went over everything with a wire brush, so if you have a brass wire brush, that works perfect to remove the old silicone. And then I also used a wire brush to get underneath all the parts that I cut, just to make sure that everything was completely deburred and it looked great. And then I also put some high temp black paint on some of the parts that were chipping, and of course where I cut. Not that it would rust, because this is filled with oil 100% of the time, but just, you know, obviously to make everything look nice and ready to go. Also the bottom, there's some cracks on there, so. But she is gonna dry for a little bit, and then now it's time to put the oil pickup and gasket on there, which that little tab looks like it's down there. And then we're gonna go ahead and torque that down. All right, so after a bunch of drying up sealant all over my hands, I was able to get all the bolts on. So there are two on the Neo that, surprisingly, you need a larger bolt. So if you look, this thing's a 14, basically the same size bolts as what you'll see on the side of the block. So make sure on this particular one, in the front, let's make sure I can see you here. So this one, make sure you drill that hole larger. Luckily I had one of these, where is it at? I have a bunch of crap here. Okay, so make sure for this side here, you do drill that larger to accept the 14mm. I had to use this thing to grind out the hole just for this to fit, because I just didn't want to take everything else off. If you notice, I did have to use an Allen head bolt in that one spot, just because I couldn't get close enough with the bolts that were provided, or the bolts that I purchased. There was just no way to get it actually flush on there, so I had to use one of those. But I did use the same lock washer that these came with. To be honest, I wouldn't recommend these, because they don't have kind of like a starter pitch, like, or a starter portion on the actual bolt, which helps. It'd be really nice if you could use a Phillips screwdriver on these, because trying to get this on evenly with a 10mm and thread it in correctly without stripping it. So you gotta be careful on these two. But I went around and made sure everything was nice and tight. But she's on. It doesn't look half bad. Now I don't have to worry about oil spilling all over the place. just because it keeps dripping with little bits of oil here and there. Alright, so we got the rear main seal on, brand new, and we also have the oil pan finally on. For something so simple, it became probably the most tedious thing I've had to do so far on this motor. And if that's the extent of having to modify and spend a couple hours just trying to get this thing right, I think we're in a good boat. We're in a good position. So, but yeah. So if you guys are doing this for yourself, the only two things that I would recommend is making sure to pre-drill that hole. Again, when you see it, it'll be on the alternator side and underneath here, so it's basically the second bolt from the front. Drill that out larger so they can accept the 14, and have a separate bolt. Hey, oh yeah, here it is. I was like, where the heck was it? So if you look, it does, like what I did to modify that does not look that bad. Like you wouldn't even notice if you were looking at it here that wasn't factory. Alright you guys, so hopefully that helps you out with your build. If you guys are doing something similar with either a Neo motor or the RB26 and you're going rear wheel drive, this should apply to both those platforms. As always guys, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it helps you out in your build, and we'll see you in the next one. Later.